Now, welcome to the first video in my yet unnamed series, and I'm open to suggestions for a name in the comments below, that will go through all the MCU movies and rate and rank them, much like I've done with Star Wars movies, characters, and so on, where I start with a poll, and then I read and respond to comments, all the while compiling a master list. And I thought there was no better place to start than with the movie that kicked off the MCU, which of course is the first Iron Man movie. So let us waste no time and get right to the results, where we'll see that 36% of voters thought the first Iron Man movie was amazing and deserved 5 stars. 55% then thought it was good and gave it 4 stars. 8% said about average and gave it 3, which left 1% to give it only 2 stars and a final 1% to give it just 1 star. And so when we do all the math here, Iron Man, the first film, ends up with an average score of 4.23 stars, which, well, puts it into first place overall currently. Big surprise, I know, considering it is the first one we've done. Though by the time you're watching this, the poll for The Incredible Hulk should be up, and if you're curious, I'm just going to go in order of release for the films. I'm not going to vote on which one we should do next or anything like that, just the strict release order. But anyway, before getting to your comments, just let me once again say thank you to everyone who votes, comments, and watches these videos. It is all greatly appreciated, and I hope you enjoy this upcoming series. And now let's begin with the top rated comment, which this time came to us from Back to the Future Fan 88, who said, "Solid A. For me, Tony's growth and change throughout his first movie shows that no matter what you've done, you can still turn your life around and change yourself for the better. And his relationship with the ensign is so unique. It's a shame he's kind of forgotten by the MCU, considering that he encouraged Tony and said what Tony would live by for the rest of his life. Don't waste your life." And not that I disagree or anything, it's a great comment, but I find it maybe a little funny or ironic that you mention how Tony turns his life around in this film, and that it's never too late to start doing the right thing, when you consider, in the MCU at least, he's one of the richest people on the planet. Because a lot of the time here in the real world, I think we like to equate wealth to happiness and being satisfied with who we are or what we've done. That wealth is not only the ultimate marker for success in life, but sort of a sign of being content with who we are and what we've accomplished. And though I'm not trying to imply we should be sympathetic towards the filthy rich or anything, or the lives they lead, one thing I do love about this movie is it kind of flips this idea or belief on its head. Because here's an extremely rich and self-centered guy who has a terrible and harrowing experience that no amount of money can get him out of, and he's forced to save himself. He comes to realize during this that he's built a fortune from, pretty much literally, the blood of other people, and it ends up truly deeply impacting him when he figures that out. And it happens in a believable way that from beginning to end we see a different person emerge right before our eyes. I mean, for years he's used his intelligence to build weapons without giving much thought to the ramifications of that. And though, yes, the Iron Man suit is technically a weapon, no doubt about it, he ends up in this cave building something just to save his life, and hopefully Jensen's too. And he quickly realizes that he can continue to do something like this. He can continue to use his intelligence to create things that help and protect others instead of just mindlessly creating weapons and profiting from it. And he eventually takes all this responsibility to protect others upon himself, though at first I do think he does, in large part, do it for the fame and recognition it brings, hence the whole "I am Iron Man" line at the end of the first movie. But over time, over the course of the next 20 movies or so, not that he's in all of them, we see him, for the most part, put his ego in check. We see him become someone completely different from where he started. And again, it's done in a believable way, and a lot of the credit obviously has to go right to Robert Downey Jr. and his acting. You could say it feels like he was born to play this character. Alright, and our next comment here comes to us from Ahsoka Romanoff, who said, "It's not my favorite Marvel movie by a long shot, but it's a great movie, and it paved the way for so many other amazing movies and characters. 5 stars. Then there's also this one from Giancarlo, who said, "I wouldn't say it's a perfect film, but since it was the perfect entry to the MCU, I'm giving it 5 stars. We also had this one from Gojira Wars 03, who said, "Still the best and most well-grounded film of the entire series." Also, we have this one from Into the Ether, who said, "Iron Man has always been my favorite since I was a kid because he had no special powers. I felt like becoming him was achievable if only I could think of the plans for the suit and gain the funding. I was saying for a few years before the movie came out that we were just not getting the technology to make a suitable Iron Man movie, and when it was announced, I was never so happy to be right in my life." Then there's this comment from Brofessor11 who said, "This was a really solid jumping off point for the MCU. It doesn't overwhelm you with crazy information, which makes it easily accessible to anyone. Hearing that ending line still gives me chills to this day." Okay, so something I've talked a lot about in my WandaVision and now Loki reviews is how out there and strange the MCU is getting recently. And I don't mean that in a negative way, I just mean it's getting more and more like the comic books. It's taking some of these stranger aspects or concepts or stories or characters and gradually bringing them into the MCU and doing it in a way where people have time to slowly process and digest and thus accept all the weirdness. I mean, that first Iron Man movie, in theory, is something that could-ish happen. Someone could potentially make something like an Iron Man suit, and most likely something akin to the bigger, clunkier Mark I suit. Someone like Elon Musk, for example, probably has the money, intelligence, and other resources to eventually make something like it a reality if he really wanted to. And I truly think a big part of the success of the MCU is thanks to the way they started off and then progressed. That it didn't start off with anything crazy right out of the box. That it took one of its most human and flawed and relatable characters, one of the most down-to-earth stories and heroes, and just focused on making one good and grounded movie around him, and has since slowly but surely added on new and interesting concepts and characters and all that from there. Until now, where we have a show like Loki that's explaining there are basically time cops who patrol the multiverse, or keep a multiverse from coming about, I should say. Alright, and next up here we have this comment from Jay Makowski who said, "I believe that doing an MCU poll is perfect for this channel. Since opinions about the MCU aren't really all that swayed on this channel, I think we'll get an accurate representation of how the fan base feels about the films." And that is certainly one of my hopes and one of the reasons I'm very excited to do this, because obviously when it comes to Star Wars, I have some pretty strong opinions. Now, you don't have to agree with them, but it still impacts who watches my videos to some extent, of course, probably to a great extent. For example, if I, say, hated the Clone Wars and loved the sequel trilogy, well, that'd be weird, but I'm sure it would impact my character rankings, for example. I'm sure they would look much different than they do now. Though that said, I don't know that there are really these huge divides in the MCU fanbase like there unfortunately is with Star Wars. Now sure, there are some diehard Marvel fans that really don't like the MCU and what they do with some of the stories and characters and all of that. But by and large, it's a pretty united and like-minded fanbase. And the biggest point of contention I could see is probably over the character Captain Marvel. But beyond that, not that fans all agree on what exactly is best and why. But there hasn't been much in the way of what you could call a controversy in the MCU. And I'm not saying none, I'm not saying everybody loves everything, but nothing that really has divided the fan base down to very rigid or well-defined lines, like, say, something like the sequel trilogies did for Star Wars. Moving on then, let's get to this comment from Joe Nesvik, who said, "Before Robert Downey Jr., I didn't even care about Iron Man. Got my Avengers through Spider-Man when they had a crossover. Now I'm even curious about the Iron Man comics." And I think another very impressive thing about that first Iron Man movie is, outside of people who really knew comics, no one knew or cared about who Iron Man was. I knew plenty of friends who were asking me, who is this character, what's he all about? And I remember thinking when I heard it announced that this probably isn't going to go well because, again, he doesn't have that name recognition that so many others do. He is virtually an unknown character, again, outside of that core group of Marvel fans or comic book fans. Yet now, all these years later, I think he's right up there with Superman, Spider-Man, and Batman as characters pretty much everyone at least has heard of and know something about. Okay, next up here then we have a comment from Connor Macmillan who said, "This was the perfect start to the MCU. Tony's arc is extremely compelling. My only problem would be that Ironmonger doesn't have a clear plan in it." Also, then we have this comment from Antes Bulent who said, "It's great. The ending doesn't make that much sense where the villain tries to kill Iron Man in public, but besides that, everything is great. The character arc of Tony Stark is pretty great, and all the side characters complement his story. 5 stars, no contest." Then this comment from ER who said, 4 stars. Tony is a well-written character, and it is overall a wonderful film, and the villain is good for what he is, but he's kinda two-dimensional. While a 2D villain isn't bad when stacked up against the better villains of the MCU, it is just slightly above the forgettable ones. Next, we have a comment from Julia A, who said, Tony's character growth in this movie is amazing to see, starting out from an unlikable rich person to ending showing human emotion and hope for further character development. I think the main problem with this movie is that they rely too heavily on the stereotypical bad guy motivation for Obadiah Stane, that is doing evil for the sake of doing evil. On the whole, this movie was enjoyable to watch and will be rewatched. Overall, I think this film deserves a solid B. And is often the case in superhero films or stories, the villain of the film or the arch nemesis of our hero is simply a reflection or the opposite of the hero. Ironmonger, or Obadiah Stane, is basically what Tony Stark was before what happened to him in that cave. He's someone who didn't think or care too much about the ramifications of what he was doing, and only cared about all the money and power. And there's really no motivation for him beyond that. He wants Tony out of the way so he can keep making weapons and thus keep making money and stay in power. And personally, in this case, I think the weaker villain in terms of development is somewhat forgivable, considering just how well Tony's story is done. A lot of the time, the hero becomes the hero because of something the villain has done to him, which, yes, is the case here. It was Obadiah who set him up and had him kidnapped and all that. But that doesn't exactly happen here. He doesn't figure it out to the very end who had him kidnapped and so on. In this case, it's more of a personal journey of transformation. I know it's not a great excuse for a less than stellar villain, but it honestly doesn't bother me that much because of just how good Tony's overall story is told in this movie. Alright, and now let's get to just a few final comments before wrapping this up, starting with this one from Red Stratus 97, who said, For its time it was a high A movie. I remember leaving the theater in awe at how amazing that movie was. I was so into it and for a time labeled it as one of the best superhero movies ever made. More than 10 years later, I did go back to it, and although lots of what it did and its style are very much common today, I can still appreciate what it did and the amazing series it started with the MCU. It's still an A for me, but a low A. Then there's this one from Scuba Steve, who said, It was definitely a great start to the MCU. Not perfect, not the best film in the series, but definitely a great start. Also, this comment from Shelby Chase, who said, It's been years, and yet it is still burned into my brain that moment when Tony, in his prototype armor, listens to the dying doctor, who sacrificed his life so that Tony can start to fix his mistakes. Next up, this comment from Wyatt Gray, who said, At the time when it came out, I would have given it 5 out of 5 stars. It really set a new standard for excellent superhero movies, but now that it has spawned an entire franchise, that first Iron Man movie pales in comparison to what has come from it. It is still a great movie, but it opened the way for exceptional superhero movies that never would have been possible without it. 4 of 5 stars. And finally, this comment from Ryan B, who said, It isn't the best movie objectively, but it still has an undeniable charm and a great heart. Plus, the effects are great. The Iron Man suit still looks super realistic 13 years after release. Overall, a great start to the MCU. And I agree, for so many reasons, most of which I went over, this was a great and perfect start to the MCU. And though still to this day, I regard it towards the top of my personal favorite MCU films, I just really love and enjoy watching this film, in large part just because of Robert Downey Jr. and what he does for this character of Tony Stark and Iron Man that so many people had no idea about before the movie actually came out. And I do think that, like many said in the comments, the best, though, was certainly yet to come for the MCU, but we never get to the rest of it, if not for this fantastic beginning. Well, that's all I've got for you this time. Now it's your turn to tell me what you think of the first Iron Man movie, or what I or anyone else had to say about it here in this video, or you can follow the link in the description below to vote and comment on the poll for the Incredible Hulk. Whatever the case may be, leave a comment below and let's talk some Marvel. And until next time, thanks for watching.